July 4th, 1865. High noon. The banks of the Rio Grande, Eagle Pass, Texas. General Joseph Orville Shelby sits atop his horse, staring across the rhythmic rush of the river water, the muddy line separating the United States from the Empire of Mexico. He is 34 years old, but his face is hardened like cured leather, framed by a beard that has collected the dust of 1,000 miles of retreat. In his hand he holds a flag. It is not the stars and bars that Lee lowered at Appomattox 3 months ago. It is the battle flag of his division, the Iron Brigade of the West. It is tattered, bullet-ridden, stained with the blood of Missouri and Arkansas clay. It has never been lowered in defeat. The men behind him are silent. They are the hard core, the jagged remnants. While the rest of the Confederacy has collapsed into ruin, while Lee is under house arrest and Jefferson Davis sits in a prison cell at Fortress Monroe, these men remain armed, mounted, and defiant. They are heavily gunned, 4 revolvers per man, Sharps carbines, sabers. They look less like soldiers and more like a moving arsenal. The war is over. The world has declared it. The papers in New Orleans and St. Louis scream it. But in Shelby's mind, the war does not end with a signature on a piece of paper. It ends when the will to fight is extinguished, and Joe Shelby's will is burning hot. He turns to his men. He does not offer comfort. He offers a choice that is also a death sentence for their past lives. Behind them lies the United States, a land now governed by the people they spent 4 years killing. Ahead lies Mexico, a country torn apart by its own civil war, ruled by an Austrian archduke, infested with bandits, Juaristas, and French legionnaires. To stay is to surrender. To cross is to become a man without a country. Shelby signals to his cousin, Colonel Henry Ives. They take the flag. They do not fold it. They attach it to a large stone from the riverbank. With a heavy splash, they sink the banner into the Rio Grande. The charcoal-grey water swallows the red and blue silk. It is a funeral for a nation that no longer exists. Shelby pulls the plume from his hat and tosses it into the water after the flag. He looks at his men. "The die is cast," he says. The voice is low, gravelly, stripped of all ornamentation. He spurs his horse into the water. The splashing kicks up, and one by one, 500 undefeated men follow him into the current. They are leaving America. They are the only organized Confederate force that will never surrender. To understand why a man would march an army into a foreign desert rather than go home, you have to understand the specific breed of violence that bred Joseph Shelby. The war in the East, the war of Lee and Grant, was a war of maneuver, of grand armies and gentlemanly protocols, even amidst the slaughter. The war in the West, in Missouri, Arkansas, and the Kansas border, was a knife fight in a burning house. Shelby was a wealthy hemp planter from Kentucky who moved to Missouri. He was an aristocrat, yes, but of the frontier variety. When the war started, he didn't just enlist, he raised a cavalry company and turned them into the shock troops of the Trans-Mississippi. By 1864, the Confederacy was being strangled. Vicksburg had fallen, cutting off the West from the East. The Trans-Mississippi Department, commanded by Edmund Kirby Smith, was essentially a separate country, Kirby Smithdom, operating without orders or supplies from Richmond. In this vacuum, Shelby thrived. He was a master of the raid. In the autumn of 1863, he rode 1,500 miles through Union-held Missouri, destroying $1 million in supplies, killing 600 federal troops, and recruiting from the very towns occupied by the enemy. He was a ghost. He struck where the Union was weak, vanished when they were strong, and rode his horses until they died, then stole fresh ones from the enemy. But by the spring of 1865, the reality on the ground had shifted catastrophically. On April 9th, Lee surrendered. The news took weeks to trickle west. When it arrived, it hit the Trans-Mississippi like a physical blow. Then came the surrender of Joe Johnston in North Carolina. Then Richard Taylor in Alabama. The dominoes were falling. The pressure on General Kirby Smith in Shreveport was immense. The Union had massed a massive force on the border. They offered terms, moderate terms. "Go home, sign a parole, and we won't hang you." Shelby was in Texas when he heard the rumors of surrender. He rode hard to Shreveport, bursting into Kirby Smith's headquarters. The scene was one of pathetic bureaucratic collapse. Clerks were burning papers, officers were drinking away their anxiety. Smith was paralyzed by indecision. Shelby slammed his fist on the map table. He proposed a plan that was practically insane but technically possible. "The army is not beaten," he told Smith. He wanted to concentrate the remaining cavalry, about 15,000 men, and rush them to Texas. There they would hold out, or if necessary, cross into Mexico, ally with the Emperor Maximilian, and continue the war from across the border, or perhaps sell their swords to the highest bidder to finance a new start. Smith, tired and broken, looked at Shelby as if he were a madman. Smith wanted peace. He wanted to stop the bleeding. On June 2, 1865, aboard a Union steamer in Galveston Harbor, Kirby Smith signed the surrender of the Trans-Mississippi Department. Technically, Shelby was included in that surrender. Legally, he was now a prisoner of war awaiting parole. Shelby gathered his division at Corsicana, Texas. He stood on a wagon bed and addressed them. He told them the government had fallen. He told them their commanders had capitulated. But then he laid out the cold logistics of his own soul. "I will not surrender," he said. "I will not go home to be treated like a serf in the land my fathers built. I am going to Mexico. Those of you who have families, go to them. You have done your duty. But those of you who have the fire still in you, those who cannot stomach the yoke, come with me." A silence stretched over the dusty field. Then a shifting of ranks. Men began to move. Some turned their horses north, toward home and the bitterness of defeat. But 1,000 men stayed. Shelby looked them over. He knew 1,000 was too many for a fast march through the desert. He needed the elite. He needed the men who could ride 50 miles a day on a handful of parched corn. He cut the force down. He selected the best horses, the best guns, the hardest men. They raided the Confederate sub-treasury in San Antonio, liberating silver bullion that was technically now U.S. property. Shelby didn't steal it. He distributed it to his men to buy supplies, and kept the rest to fund the expedition. This act alone made them outlaws. They weren't just soldiers anymore. To the Union, they were armed bank robbers fleeing justice. As they moved south toward the Rio Grande, the Grand Army of the Trans-Mississippi dissolved around them. It was a chaotic, shameful disintegration. Soldiers looted their own depots. Officers tore off their insignia and fled in civilian clothes. Through this anarchy, Shelby's column moved like a Roman legion. They maintained strict discipline. When they encountered a group of renegades looting a civilian store, Shelby ordered his men to clear them out at gunpoint. He was leaving the country, but he refused to leave it as a bandit. He would leave as a general. July 1865. The Mexican desert. The state of Coahuila. The crossing of the Rio Grande was the spiritual climax, but the physical reality of Mexico was the punishment that followed. Mexico in 1865 was a slaughterhouse. The country was locked in a vicious war between the Republicans, Juaristas, led by Benito Juarez and supported by the United States, and the Imperialists, led by Emperor Maximilian, a puppet monarch installed by Napoleon III of France. Shelby's column, now known as the Iron Brigade of the West, or simply Shelby's expedition, was walking into a crossfire. They were foreigners, heavily armed, carrying Confederate silver, riding through a land where law and order had ceased to exist 10 years prior. The heat in the Coahuila Desert is a radiant violence. It bounces off the hard pan and strikes you from below as well as above. Water was scarce. The horses began to suffer. Shelby, riding a large grey mare, seemed impervious. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate what the men ate, tough beef jerky and tortillas bought from local rancheros. Their first test of reality came not from an army, but from the landscape and the chaotic elements that lived in it. They were shadowed by Juarista guerrillas. These weren't European-style soldiers. They were fighters who knew every cactus and ravine. They watched the Confederates from the ridges, waiting for a straggler, a lame horse, a moment of weakness. Shelby adapted instantly. He instituted a rolling box formation. The wagons and pack mules were in the center. The cavalry rode on the flanks, carbines unslung, hammers resting on percussion caps. Near the town of Piedras Negras, the local Juarista governor, Biesca, demanded Shelby sell him his cannons and arms. Biesca needed guns to fight the French. He offered a fortune in gold. It was a tempting offer. These men were destitute exiles. The gold could set them up for life. But Shelby looked at the ragtag, undisciplined Juarista force and shook his head. He was a conservative, a man of hierarchy. He viewed the Juaristas as anarchists. His sympathies naturally lay with the Emperor Maximilian, a man of order, a monarch. "I will not sell my guns to a mob," Shelby told Biesca. Biesca threatened to attack. Shelby laughed. He deployed his artillery, 4 shiny Napoleons, and lined up his 500 veterans. "Come and take them," was the message. Biesca, looking at the silent, bearded men who had survived 4 years of hell in Missouri, decided to let them pass. The march continued deeper into the interior. The sensory landscape shifted from the dusty scrub of the border to the high, thin air of the Sierra Madre. The nights turned freezing. The men wrapped themselves in their saddle blankets, sleeping with their revolvers by their heads. They arrived in the city hoping to be welcomed as heroes by the French garrison. They were the elite of the South, after all. Surely the French, who were fighting a desperate war against US-backed guerrillas, would welcome a brigade of battle-hardened American cavalry. The French commander in Monterey, General John Ross, was a veteran of the Foreign Legion. He was cold, professional, and suspicious. He saw Shelby not as a fellow aristocrat, but as a dangerous variable. 500 American irregulars in his territory. That wasn't a reinforcement, that was a potential mutiny. Shelby requested safe passage to Mexico City to see the Emperor. Joining Ross granted it, but he watched them leave with narrow eyes. The march from Monterey to Mexico City was a nightmare of guerrilla warfare. They were ambushed in canyons. They fought running battles with bandits who rolled boulders down on them from the cliffs. In one engagement near Paris, Shelby's men were attacked by 2,000 Juarista cavalry. This was the moment where the myth of the lost cause met the cold steel of mercenary reality. Shelby didn't fight for glory here. He fought for survival. He directed the fire with the precision of a conductor. The Confederates, using their Sharps carbines, decimated the attackers. They killed hundreds. It was a massacre. The Missourians fought with a cold, terrifying efficiency. They weren't defending their homes anymore. They were killing anything that tried to stop them from reaching their destination. But the losses mounted. Men died of fever. Horses broke legs and had to be shot. The glamour of the expedition was being ground down by the dust of the road. August 1865. Mexico City. They finally reached the capital. The Valley of Mexico opened up before them, green and lush, ringed by volcanoes. It was a paradise compared to the deserts they had crossed. They rode into the city, their grey uniforms faded to white by the sun, their horses gaunt but groomed. Shelby secured an audience with Emperor Maximilian and Empress Carlota at Chapultepec Castle. This was the end game. This was the moment Shelby had played for. He walked into the gilded halls of the castle, his boots clicking on the marble. He stood before the Habsburg Emperor. Shelby made his pitch. He didn't just offer his 500 men. He claimed he could recruit 40,000 ex-Confederates. He proposed that Maximilian allow him to form a foreign legion of Americans to smash the Juarista resistance and stabilize the throne. In exchange, he wanted land for Confederate colonization. Maximilian listened. He was a tall, well-meaning man, but he was plagued by indecision and bad advice. His French advisors were terrified of provoking the United States. The U.S. Civil War was over, and the Union Army was now the most powerful fighting force on the planet. If Maximilian accepted Shelby's offer, the U.S. might interpret it as an act of war and invade Mexico to oust the French. Maximilian looked at Shelby. He saw the competence, the danger, and the utility, but he also saw the geopolitical noose tightening around his own neck. "I cannot employ you as soldiers," Maximilian said. The words hung in the air like smoke. He offered them land. He offered them the chance to become farmers, colonists in the Carlota colony near Veracruz. But he would not let them fight. He would not let them be what they were. The rejection broke the cohesion of the Iron Brigade. Shelby had led them across a continent on the promise of continued war, or at least honorable service. Now they were told to beat their swords into plowshares in a foreign jungle. The meeting at Chapultepec was the death of the dream. There was no new Confederacy to be built here. There was only a dying empire and a plot of jungle land. Shelby accepted the verdict with stoicism. He walked out of the castle and returned to his men. He didn't lie to them, he told them the truth. The fighting was done. The unit disbanded. The scene was less dramatic than the burial of the flag, but far more tragic. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder for 4 years shook hands and walked away in different directions. Some went to the colony to farm coffee. Some drifted to the coast to catch ships to Brazil or back to the States. Some drank themselves to death in the cantinas of Mexico City. Shelby himself tried his hand at freighting, at farming. He watched as the French Empire collapsed. He watched as Maximilian was captured and executed by a firing squad in 1867. Shelby, the man who refused to surrender, eventually had to bow to the ultimate reality, home. In 1867, With the empire gone and Mexico unsafe, he rode back to the border. He didn't ride at the head of an army this time. He rode as a civilian. He crossed the Rio Grande, back into the United States. He was not arrested. The anger of the war had cooled just enough. He returned to Missouri, to his farm. The one general who refused to surrender ended his days not in a blaze of glory, but as a witness. He testified at the trials of his former enemies, sometimes in their defense, honoring the brotherhood of combat. He was appointed U.S. Marshal for the Western District of Missouri in 1893, a federal officer of the government he had once despised. But the legend of the expedition remained. It was the grit, the refusal to bow, the sheer logistical audacity of marching 1,000 men through hell just to say no. When Joe Shelby died in 1897, they buried him in Kansas City, but in the minds of the men who rode with him, he was always still there, on the banks of the Rio Grande, throwing his plume into the water, turning his back on defeat, and riding south into the fire.